Hello and welcome to Success Stories. I'm your host, Alan Mendenhall, Associate Dean of the Sorrell College of Business at Troy University. Success Stories is a program of the Sorrell College of Business that highlights the lives and careers of people who have accomplished great things. And I'm joined here today as a first with two guests. I've got Frye Gaillard with me and Cynthia Tucker. Cynthia was born in Monroeville, attended Auburn University, and majored in English and journalism. She wrote for the Plainsman there. She had a long and distinguished career at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. She won the Pulitzer Prize in 2007. She served as a professor of journalism and a distinguished writer-in-residence at the University of Georgia. She's currently journalist-in-residence at the University of South Alabama, and she just won the Harper Lee Award. And Frye was the person who hosted the award and gave her the award, and that was just a couple weeks ago. Frye was born in Mobile. He graduated from Vanderbilt University. You've witnessed many historical events. I read that you witnessed Martin Luther King getting arrested in the 60s, and you invited Bobby Kennedy to speak shortly before his assassination. You've written numerous books. In fact, I reviewed one of your books back in 2012 for Southern Literary Review.
Oh, I remember that.
Yeah, I went back and reread that, and I thought, oh, that was not my best review. But the book was better than the review. But he's currently writer-in-residence at the University of South Alabama, so thank you both for joining me. Cynthia, I'll start with you. When did you first start writing? When did you decide that you wanted to write for a living?
Well, I went to Auburn actually as a pre-med major.
Oh, wow.
And I ran into a calculus course that persuaded me that perhaps I should try something I was better at. But you know, as a kid in Monroeville, I loved to read and I loved to try my hand at writing. And so as a kid, I was trying to write poems and trying to write short stories. And I wrote for my high school newspaper. So when that calculus course changed my mind, I thought, you know, maybe you should try journalism. And it absolutely was the right thing for me.
Well, it sure was. You certainly succeeded in your field. And Frye, what about you? When did you decide you wanted to be a writer?
You know, I think I came to it a little more slowly. I grew up in a family of lawyers and just assumed that I was going to be a lawyer. They did, I did, you know. But I went off to college in the 1960s, and I became so fascinated and absorbed with all that was happening in this country during that time. You mentioned the happenstance of my seeing Martin Luther King arrested in 1963 when I was still in high school, and we brought Robert Kennedy and a number of other historical figures to Vanderbilt. I also got there the same year that the first class of African-American undergraduates got to Vanderbilt. And so all of those kinds of issues, the issues of race and the issues of social justice and all of those things were very much in the air. And I joined the student newspaper staff, and that was kind of my way of connecting with what seemed to me, even at the time, I was a history major, and it seemed to me, even at the time, that history was unfolding, you know, right before our eyes, and so writing about it was a way of trying to make sense of it. And so then I kind of had to learn to write, and you know, you do that in two ways. One is you read a lot, which I already love to do, and then you just practice, and you start out writing kind of badly, and hopefully you get better.
Well, that's great. And Cynthia, I grew up reading your newspaper opinions. I was from Atlanta. I grew up in Marietta, but sort of on the Sandy Springs side, about 5 minutes from Roswell Square, which I'm sure you know sort of the area that I'm talking about. And you are such a compelling writer. You had such a strong voice, and you had a tendency to make people really agree with you or really disagree with you, and that was powerful. I'm wondering how much of your writing career was motivated by a sense of a pursuit of justice or for political purposes, and where that came from.
You know, I think much of my career was motivated by a thirst for social justice, although when I began my career as a reporter, I didn't think of it that way. Frye talks about learning to write, And back in the day, one of the best places to learn was at newspapers, covering all kinds of stories, and if you had good editors, getting better. And as Frye was talking about arriving at Vanderbilt at an exciting time, I arrived in Atlanta at an exciting time. President Carter was then Governor Carter, running for president. And I wasn't covering his campaign, but I can tell you everybody in the newsroom was excited by that. Maynard Jackson had already been elected the first black mayor of Atlanta and becoming one of the most powerful political figures in the nation. That was exciting. And I got to cover him in City Hall. And so by the time I was given the wonderful job of opinion writing, I was already understanding that I could use that forum in the same way that Ralph McGill had, to urge my readers to do the right thing. And not just white readers who were still struggling with the grips of racism, but my black readers too, to understand that you need to be ethical, to say to black politicians, don't emulate the worst of the white politicians you've known, the Talmadges. Don't be corrupt, do the right thing. And it was a wonderful forum for me. And yes, I did make a lot of people angry. But on those days when I had made people on the left and the right angry, I knew I must be saying the right thing.
I like that a lot. We hear a lot about declines and the decline in journalistic standards, and maybe this has something to do with technology and social media and just instant information. Do you think there's something to that criticism? Is that a fair criticism?
I think that social media have done a lot for us. They have given us some tremendous advantages. I can research an old quote a lot faster than I used to be able to. The downside, unfortunately, is that anybody can write on Facebook or Twitter or all of the other platforms, at any website. There are no gatekeepers. Back in the dark ages, when Frye and I were at newspapers, there were editors who tried to make sure that what we said was accurate. There are no gatekeepers on many of these social media platforms, and so anybody can write anything. And unfortunately, I've discovered that many people will believe anything. Frye, is there anything you want to add to that?
Well, I think the economics of newspapers changed a lot too, and even today I'm a little mystified by that, even though I lived through it. But newspapers, it seemed to me, became less and less ambitious about what they were trying to do. The budgets, if they didn't shrink, they didn't grow very fast, and it became just harder and harder to do the kind of work that some of us wanted to do at newspapers. And so, you know, that's one of the things that pushed me in the direction of freelancing, writing books, writing for magazines, alternative papers, whatever it might be. It was kind of a heartbreaking change to me, because when I first started at the Charlotte Observer, which was a fine Southern newspaper, as was the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. I mean, like, you know, we used to have conversations among reporters, and we would say to each other, don't tell them how much fun we're having, or they might not even think they need to pay us, you know. I mean, it was that cool, you know, to be a young reporter. And it just continued to change, and so, you know, had to look for other ways to tell stories.
And how are you so prolific? What do you do? Do you have to discipline yourself? Do you have daily routines? How do you churn out so many books? I don't even know how many you've written. I didn't count before I came over, but several.
Yeah, you know, I think newspapers gave me good habits in terms of being self-motivated. You know, there were always deadlines, and so, you know, it's not, you don't at a newspaper, you don't sit waiting for the muse. You know, it's deadline time. You got to get the story done. And it's not an exact analogy when you're writing books, but there is a work ethic that comes out of that. And so, and there are just so many stories that are, you know, that feel like they need telling, you know. So that's what keeps me going, you know. And for me, it started with a fascination with social justice and those kinds of issues, but it kind of expanded from that into a sense of culture, you know, things like music and religion and literature and things that are not necessarily as directly political. You know, also, I thought shed light on our time, on our place, and so those were things as well that, you know, that I found myself writing about over time.
Well, you have both just co-authored a book, The Southernization of America, A Story of Democracy in the Balance. What was it like to collaborate on a book? I know you sort of divided chapters and you co-authored certain chapters, but what was it like to collaborate with somebody on a book? Was this a first for both of you?
Well, this is my first book, period. And I'm delighted that you asked Frye the question you just asked him, because he is very prolific. And I am a veteran of newspapers as well, and I'm still in awe of the way Frye works. The book idea came from the editor at New South, which is located right here in Montgomery, a wonderful small publishing house that is both dedicated to books about the South and dedicated to the idea of social justice. Randall Williams, the editor there, has worked with Frye many times in the past, and he contacted Frye about a follow-up to John Edgerton's book, published in the 70s. Edgerton wrote The Americanization of Dixie, the Southernization of America, which was also a collection of essays about our time and place then, in the 70s. Randall asked Frye about a follow-up, and Frye contacted me, and I was honored to be asked, honored that he thought enough of my work to ask me to participate. And the process was very easy. Frye's very easy to work with. And you know, he and I grew up on opposite sides of the racial divide, but we've come to see that and the South in very similar ways. Both the South's, the side we're not so proud of, but also the South's promise. And so the process was very collegial.
And you both live in Mobile, in
We
the
do.
Mobile area, which
And
certainly
both
makes
teach
it
at
convenient.
South.
At
so,
South Alabama,
yeah.
that's right. Well, tell us a little bit about the thesis of the book.
Well, it argues that over really the whole history of the country, from colonial times to now, the South and the rest of the country have interacted with each other. The dark side of that, in terms of what the South exported to the rest of the country, was that the South was the epicenter of slavery from colonial times on up through the Civil War. Therefore, the South was also the epicenter of racism for the country, with all of the hatred, the fear, the anti-democratic impulses, all of those things that are sort of bound up in that. That was part of the legacy of the South, that as the South became more like the rest of the country, and as its isolation began to break down because of television and interstate highways and then the internet and all of that, inevitably the South influenced, we think, the rest of the country in some not so great ways. On the other hand, there's another side to the South, and there always has been in a way, but it became most visible during the civil rights years of the 1950s and 60s. And that civil rights South, and then right after that, the South of Jimmy Carter. Carter was very articulate about how living through the civil rights era influenced the human rights policies that were one of the foundations of his presidency. And so there was that South too, the South of John Lewis, and more currently the South of Stacey Abrams, or the South of Raphael Warnock, the South of Doug Jones. People who believe in democracy, small d, but who also believe that inevitably we're in it together. This is a multicultural country, and we have to come at that inevitable, immutable fact with some inclination to respect each other across these potential barriers, or else it's not going to be a very happy place to live. And there have always been people in the South who've understood that maybe more clearly than anybody else, because there was a cost to that understanding. You know, you had to push back against some pretty serious realities in order to hold to that view. So we present those two aspects of the Southern character and write about how they have both, since Edgerton's work in the 1970s, sort of played out in the mainstream, in the consciousness, in the lifeblood of the country.
One of my favorite plays is actually a trilogy, but it's Aeschylus's the Oresteia, which is a 5th century Greek text, and it begins with sort of Agamemnon's murder by Clytemnestra, his wife, and then Orestes seeks vengeance and commits matricide, kills his mother. At that point, the Furies, which are these goddesses who represent vengeance, seek relentlessly to avenge the death of Clytemnestra. And there's sort of a blood feud, a cycle of violence. And then Athena, the goddess of wisdom, intervenes at some point, and she establishes processes and procedures, rule of law, a public forum, the exercise of reason. And these things are meant to sort of curb what is a violent cycle, a violent and vicious cycle, and to channel anger and the desire for justice through a system. And it's no wonder that this text is sort of central to Greek thought and celebrates the rise of the rule of law and processes such as that. I'm curious, because then, it's 5 centuries later, you have the birth of Christ, and then you have the ideal of forgiveness, which enters the world stage and spreads like wildfire throughout the world. I'm wondering, in the United States of America, what does it mean? What do those concepts of forgiveness and justice and vengeance mean? How do they play out in our story? Because they're 3 different things, and there's certainly righteous anger, and there's also maybe excessive anger. How do you balance the two? I think about the story you told about John Lewis extending forgiveness to George Wallace, which is a remarkable story, and certainly not something that John Lewis had to do.
Right. Can I start with that? Do you
Please.
mind? So one of the astonishing things to me is to think about the example of John Lewis or Martin Luther King, or if you go back to the days of Reconstruction, the first African American congressman from Alabama was from Selma. He was a man named Benjamin Turner. And Benjamin Turner, he ran on the platform of universal amnesty, universal suffrage. And what he meant was universal suffrage, full political, civic rights for former slaves. Universal amnesty was don't punish former Confederates. We have to bind up the wounds and move forward together. So there was almost this Nelson Mandela sensibility bequeathed to this country by African Americans who could have taken quite understandably a different view, and some did. But the amazing thing was, from then through the civil rights movement, through the presidency of Barack Obama, through the life of John Lewis, there is this amazing example that has been set for the country of forgiveness, but not cheap grace. You know, we also have to seek justice in the process of making forgiveness mean anything. And so, you know, we have that to draw on in this country. And we better do it, because if we don't, if we get caught in that cycle of violence that, you know, Aeschylus wrote about in the play that you mentioned, which is a possibility. I mean, we see it on the horizon now. I mean, it's just so obvious that no good comes of that. I mean, nothing happens with that except more of the same. And we have to break that cycle. And in terms of policies, I don't know how to do it, but we can all bear witness, you know, and that's kind of what we're trying to do with this book, you know, is bear witness.
You know, one of the reasons I think that trilogy of plays still commands so much attention is that from early Greek history to now, human beings haven't changed. The human heart, as Billy Graham once said to me, hasn't changed. We still struggle with the impulse for vengeance, anger, fear, resentment of the other, which is a primal instinct, perhaps. But the Greeks helped to give us, and then the Enlightenment in Europe established a foundation for the rule of law and other channels through which we could have a society that didn't always lapse into anger and vengeance and resentment and fear. And the United States, though the founding was imperfect, the founding documents call for all of that. And for more than 200 years, we've had a nation that seemed to be haltingly, not steadily, but haltingly moving toward those ideals of equality and rule of law and social justice, equality for everyone. But we fear, as the book points out, that those other impulses have also surged to the fore, and it's hard sometimes to know which way we're headed.
There's so many questions I want to ask, and we're going to run out of time. I'm not going to be able to ask them all, but I am curious, what makes, you see sort of nationalist populism arising throughout the world, you know, with Duterte in the Philippines and Bolsonaro in Brazil and Geert Wilders and Boris Johnson, Rodrigo Duterte, I think I mentioned him, but Xi Jinping and Putin, and on the left side, Maduro and Venezuela, and Eric Zemmour in France, who's running for the presidential seat there. What makes the Southernization of America distinct from those sorts of nationalist populism? I know I'm not a political scientist, and I know both those terms, nationalism and populism, are complex and loaded terms in those fields, and I'm just using them sort of out of convenience. But what makes the Southernization of America different from those sort of global phenomena?
I would argue that what makes the South and the United States different is that we have experimented with both. The post-Reconstruction era was one in which there were lots of whites who talked about populism, but what they actually meant was white supremacy. And so they dedicated themselves to that ideal. But we've also, in the South, had the civil rights movement, where the South dedicated itself, or many of us anyway, to the opposite, to the ideal of equality for all. And I would like to, first of all, the South has thrived with that ideal in place. The South has become a much more economically successful region once the civil rights movement became more or less successful. So I would hope other nations, not just the US, but other nations would learn from that example.
And do you think it is constructive and good for reasonable people of good faith? We're talking about people who are willing and able to carry on constructive dialogue, not people that are just willing to, you know,
Right.
not find agreement. Do you think it is a good thing for reasonable people of good faith to talk about their disagreements and to work through them and to understand each other's point of view, that we ought to be having more of that in our society?
I think absolutely. I remember one of the kind of touchstone moments for me. I got out of college in the late 1960s, and America was pretty divided then. And some of us who were righteous in our commitment to, you know, to social justice, to racial justice, to you know, equality for women, whatever the cause may be, we could be pretty darn sure in our own minds that we were absolutely right, and anybody who disagreed with us was not only wrong, but maybe stupid and not worth listening to. And with that kind of a mindset, which I had fallen, you know, when you're young, it's sometimes easy to get pretty self-righteous, or at least it was for me. Well, I read an article in Harper's Magazine by Bill Moyers, which was called Listening to America. And Moyers was lamenting the fact that we've forgotten how to disagree. He said the veneer of civility has been stripped away. And that just stayed with me, you know, that we have, that's what a democracy is. You know, in a country this size, it's too big for everybody to agree. People have different experiences, bring different backgrounds to it, but there has to be that good faith openness and willing to converse and respectfully disagree, or democracies don't do very well, you know.
Well, Frye and Cynthia, it's amazing to say this, but we are out of time. I just wish we could do this for hours because we were just getting started, but I really appreciate you coming on the show. It was very nice to meet you both, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Alan.
Thanks, Alan.
This has been Success Stories, a program of the Sorrell College of Business.